PodCastle, episode 877 for Tuesday the 4th of February 2025. The Hand That Feeds by Louis Inglis Hall, read by Pippa Alice Stevens and produced by Devin Martin. Rated PG-13, with a content note for the death of a child. Good morning, good day, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to PodCastle, the flying castle of fantasy fiction. I'm your host Matt Dovey, and it is my privilege to present for your enjoyment The Hand That Feeds by Louis Inglis Hall, narrated by Pippa Alice Stevens. This story was first published in The Coloured Lens, autumn 2023. Louis Inglis Hall is a civil servant living in Scotland. His work has appeared in Clarksworld, Strange Horizons and Apparition Lit, amongst others. Pippa Alice Stevens is an actress and voiceover artist. She can be seen in The Invisible Wall, playing Rose Barkley, and Spiralling, playing Natalie. And now pay attention, for our tale is about to begin, and it's important you listen and learn this lesson.
The Hand That Feeds by Louis Inglis Hall, read by Pippa Alice Stevens. Last Christmas, a mermaid died in the school swimming pool. It was only a small pool, built up at the sides with wooden panels, more like a tank for training children in. That meant it froze over very easily, but a mermaid couldn't know that. It stood in a courtyard in the shadow of the school, and the sun reached it only at rare intervals. Behind it lurked a stone and sulking outhouse, pebble-dash walls lashed together with a corrugated plastic roof. In its damp darkness, the children undressed and tripped and snapped tight, powdered rubber caps over their skulls. Under its benches, something black grew wetly out towards them. It was the hut that Freya hated most of all. Miss Wallace had caught Archie Dorrock from upper third belting down the corridor, but she hadn't told him off, not properly. Just asked him why he needed to be rushing so quick. He said there was a mermaid dead in the pool, that it must have happened in the holidays, and Miss Wallace was so interested that she didn't ask Archie why he'd been down there on his own, which was definitely cigarettes. Miss Wallace was young and pretty, and was allowed to wear any jumper she liked, unlike Freya, who was a pupil and had to wear a plain grey one like everybody else. Miss Wallace also had colourful bracelets on her arms and hair that rose up above her head and fanned out like branches. When she moved, they swayed about her, the bracelets and the hair both. In the old years, they had a teacher for English and a teacher for history and a teacher for comparative mythology. But Freya was only 9, so Miss Wallace was her everything teacher, and she needed no other. Freya's last teacher had been Mr. Hegarty, who had folded himself into a corner of the classroom, spider-like, and spoke to them only in riddles. His interest in the outside world was oblique at best, and he'd never once worn a bracelet, or even a colourful tie. For Miss Wallace, the outside world was the whole point. It was something to push both your hands into and wiggle about. That was why Class 7C were allowed to follow her, symmetrical grey signets, through the hall and out the fire escape and down the iron stairway that led to the pool with the mermaid in it. The ice was frozen over most of it, a thin sheet, breakable. One arm punctured the surface, a long, grey-brown javelin that reached up and out and seized around the metal rung of the ladder in a tight fist. Frost followed up it and caught on the trail of fine hairs that sloped along its back. Freya couldn't see down below the ice. Miss Wallace had them at a distance. She had first dibs on exploration. Freya jostled her way to the front of the group. She knew she had to be as close as was allowed. Miss Wallace stared down at the mermaid, and her hair quivered, and her breath came out in clouds. Below her, the arm was stiff and quiet, and altogether too close to her throat. In the end, it was Juno Clark who asked the question that held them all close with a ferocious anxiety. Juno asked if Miss Wallace was sure it was really dead, and Miss Wallace said yes. And everyone turned to Juno and sneered at her stupidity. Then Miss Wallace said, "I can prove it," which was something she said a lot, and she felt around inside her pockets and pulled out her fountain pen. Freya had long watched and desired that pen. It shone bronze, and under Miss Wallace's direction bled blue, looping calligraphy that far outreached Freya's lump and hieroglyphs. Miss Wallace took off the lid and lifted the pen high, and then stuck it deep, deep into the mermaid's arm. Later, when Miss Wallace encouraged them to come close, to huddle around and stroke the arm for themselves, to learn what they could from this rare chance, Freya's finger found the hole the pen had made. Without really meaning to, she dipped it inside, into the cold and sleepy meat. It resisted her, but she felt deeper. She wriggled her finger down to the end of the incision and scratched at the bone. Freya thought to herself that she might be the first person in history to reach inside a mermaid's arm and scrape their nail across the bone. And in that thought, there was no horror, but a realisation that for the first time in her life of classmates and brothers and older cousins, she had experienced something truly private, something that could not be shared and that belonged to her alone. And Freya understood that there was and would be nothing else she desired as she desired the mermaid, and she knew what she had to do next. First, before the science lesson had begun, Miss Wallace came back across the courtyard and told 7C that she had an important question. Her face was suddenly very serious, and she went round in turn and asked if any of them had put the mermaid there. And Freya said no, and Tim said no, and Fergus said no, even though if anybody had put it there, it would definitely have been him. Mary Beth asked Miss Wallace how the mermaid had got into the pool, since it hadn't been any of them, and although the class glowered at her automatically, Freya felt it was a good question. Miss Wallace said that if it hadn't been anybody in another class, then maybe it had crawled out of an estuary and dragged itself inland. Mermaids could manage that for short distances. Maybe it had seen the pool and thought in its animal mind to refresh itself. It would have heaved its long body up over the wooden side, and only when it hit the water would it have realised its mistake. There were a lot of questions now. The pack had grown both curious and tolerant. Jason wanted to know if it was a boy mermaid or a girl mermaid. Miss Wallace said she couldn't tell because of the ice, but that if the tail was big and squashy, that might mean it was full of babies. Joanna Fitch asked if it was saltwater or freshwater, and Miss Wallace reminded her that mermaids were freshwater, that if it had been saltwater, then it would have been a dead selkie instead. Juno Clark, hungry for redemption, asked what it was that had made it dead, and Miss Wallace looked a little sad and said that it was the chlorine that would have poisoned it long before the cold snap made the water freeze over. The chlorine would have filtered its way inside very fast, she told them, in a voice that tried to make it sound less painful than Freya was sure it was. When the questions were over, 7C clustered around the body in the pool. The head was quite visible from this angle, smooth with black orb eyes, wide set on a yowling face. Its nose was otter-like, a black pad of a snout that protruded enough to disrupt the human geometry of the skull. There were sprays of thick white whiskers on either side, and the teeth below were small and sharp. The lower body was more obscured, but Freya saw a long torso studded with dark nipples, curving into one great sinuous limb coiled beneath it. It was a dumb animal, and dead, but in that it was entirely beautiful. It was nearly time to go back inside. 7C had had their fill of the mermaid's dead hand. Some of them were getting bored and were stamping their feet. Freya took her chance when Miss Wallace was distracted by Jason, who had found a pine cone and was proud of it. An ill trophy compared to what Freya had in mind. She ran her fingers over the back of the mermaid's hand one last time, over its thick knuckles and into the folds of frost-crackled webbing. She found her target, and she closed her fingers over it and pulled down hard. It broke under the skin first. She was compelled to swivel it around the joint until the skin was torn all around. And even then it was difficult. It nearly sent her flying to do it. There wasn't time to inspect her prize, just to thrust it down into the quiet black of her trouser pocket. She could feel it, small and cold, and curled like a monkey nut. She squeezed her fist around it, and the tiny spark of selfishness that had jumped inside her blazed. She was an inferno. She would collapse if only something separated her from this fragment, this fossil of a perfect moment, and a beautiful thing now dead. As they trooped back up the stairway and into the honey warmth of the school, Joanna said it was funny. She had expected it to look more like a person. The others scoffed, but Miss Wallace heard her and said it just went to show there was a world of difference between bipedal and human. And then Owen said, "Miss, how can it be a biped? It didn't have any feet at all." Miss Wallace said that was a good point, but in a voice that made it sound like she wished it was Owen there, dead under the ice and trying to scratch his way out. She said that a mermaid, physiologically speaking, was an honorary biped. It was a biped in every way that mattered, except the feet. And for homework, she set them all the project of making up a word for things with 2 arms that humans and mermaids and gorillas could all be part of together, but not kangaroos or meerkats. Which seemed simple enough to Freya, as she caressed the gobbet of mermaid flesh in her pocket. Really, all it came down to was thumbs. She would have slept with it under her pillow that first night. But in the end, Freya was too excited to sleep at all. She had suffered all day in longing for it, and had gone to her room with unusual keenness. From the floor above, she could hear her brothers kicking at each other and hollering. But she did not mind. She lay on her bed with the mermaid's thumb in her palm and admired it, the back glossy with short grey fur, the underside more tender, bare skin a dark and smoky blue. It had a black dog-like little nail on it, and Freya imagined having a handful of such claws, of reaching out to a whale and anchoring herself to its great flank. Gently she tested it, pressing the point of the claw into her own nail beds, so that it manifested as a dark triangle, pushing into each of her fingers in turn. At the base of the thumb was a broken flap of webbing, a rag of tissue torn loose in her imperfect haste. This Freya resented. It was a distraction, untrue to life. She gave it a lot of thought and looked in her desk for a small pair of scissors, and she cut off the loose skin. She trimmed the thumb down until only a thin seam showed the point where anything had once connected. The thumb was neater now. She was pleased with that, but almost immediately, Freya felt a wrench of deep and desperate loss, and knew what she had done had been wrong. She ought to have kept that scrap of flesh and treasured it for as long as she could. Already there was so much less of her talisman than there was before. As she lay sleepless, Freya pictured the mermaids she had seen before, at the docks, where they clicked and barked at each other, and slithered down from the jetties and tangled together in the shallows, or else on the far banks of the river that ran through the town. They had never intrigued her. She had regarded them as essentially an optical illusion. Not people, but seals with elbows. She remembered how they would rest with their arms on the stone paving at the river's edge, their fur sparkling with water drops, and their tails thrumming in the water like great motors. Mermaids had no external ears. Miss Wallace had pointed that out. And so they would delicately lay their heads between their arms against the stone and look out at the world with black and adoring eyes, as they drank in the signals and vibrations of the people passing by. They would chirrup their appreciation and smile animal smiles, and occasionally someone would throw them an ice cream or a handful of chips. Despite their warbles and their trills, Freya had never once fed them anything. She spent the next day in despair at her recklessness, Her foolish excision of the webbing. In her dearest fantasy, she would take the thumb from her pocket and find the webbing regrown, regenerated like a severed starfish limb. Freya slept badly that night. She dreamt that the thumb had grown into something new, a crawling, 5-pronged thing with a black nail at the end of each long leg. She scrambled herself out of the nightmare and fumbled on the bedside lamp. She looked at once to the precious digit, and anxiety spiked out of her in an entirely new direction, because everything had gone wrong. Meat doesn't last forever. If the thumb had seemed a little shriveled during the day, Freya had been able to look past that. But as she examined it in the midnight lamplight, she knew it would be no use to pretend. The skin was loose and baggy, and far underneath it, the muscle felt as if it was folding in on itself. There was a stain on the bed sheets where something had been leaking out of the open end, and the whole thing was beginning to smell. Freya tucked her pillows up behind her so that she could think properly. She took a drink of water from the glass her mother had brought her before she went to bed. This was important. She didn't want a repeat of the webbing fiasco. This had to be done properly. There was freezing, or mummification. Each of those would reduce the thumb, move it further from the object of her desire. She thought about the mermaid under the ice, fresh and perfect, and somehow threw that alive, even in death. She could not let it rot away, not to one little slither. She thought about the hole in its arm, how her flesh had fitted inside its flesh, how they had in that moment unified and been whole. She wanted the thumb. She needed it forever. There really was only one option. The bone was difficult, that and the nail, but Freya drank plenty of water and eventually managed to swallow the entire thing. She felt good. The mermaid would be with her always. She was likely part mermaid herself at this point. Its bones had become her bones. As she stamped her usual route across the playground, Freya glowed. Even the sight of Jason playing catch by himself and missing couldn't lower her mood. In class, Miss Wallace said, "Thank you, Freya," when she handed out the pens, and it was clear to her that it was a different, better, deeper thank you than she would have got on any other day. Everybody at school was very excited, because Jamie Pine from 6F had thrown a ball up onto the roof, and when he had gone round to a side window to hang out and get it, he said he'd seen a griffin there, dead and mummified and buried under frisbees. It was only a small one, he cautioned, and all dried out, but it was a griffin all the same, which was at least as good as a mermaid, if not better. When Miss Wallace heard about that, she just said, and this time 7C weren't allowed out to see it. They didn't go to crowd round the janitor on his ladder as he went to fetch the corpse down, as he carefully left both ball and frisbees behind. Miss Wallace told them later it had just been a dead cat, nothing exciting, and she was fairly sure Jamie had known that all along in his heart. Freya was relieved. The mermaid was special, and people were right to be jealous. Hers was the glory. There was none left for Jamie Pine. It was time for the weekend, and Freya had new strength to endure her brothers, and activities, and family meals. She was lucky, she knew, to have achieved her heart's desire at only 9 years old. Her mother took her to the park, and on the way she didn't see one single person who had what they wanted, who was complete and done and finished the way she was. Her brothers splashed thin mud up her breeches. When she tackled them into a shy and dusty elm, it was reflex. In her head, she really didn't care at all. Freya's bedroom was on the ground floor. It looked out onto the garden and had been her mother's room once. The boys had got the upstairs room, and when Freya was born and her grandmother was dead, it had been easiest just to put her in there. Freya liked the room, which was nicely and entirely hers. She liked it all the way up to that Sunday night. Sometimes in summer, when it was noisy late, she would open the big window and give a stern look to the adults gossiping on the patio. And they would all turn and giggle and shush each other. That was part of the downstairs bedroom routine. That was protocol. This wasn't summer though, and her parents were upstairs, and Freya knew that under no circumstances should she look out of the big window tonight. It began with a crackle of disturbance, of mathematical shrubs disordered by some clambering weight. It sounded like a sack being dragged up the garden path, colliding with pots, displacing careful ornaments. Freya stared pointedly at the ceiling and felt her insides all stop working. This was a heavier breed of garden sound than she had heard before. She was the master of small and rustling things. The sound dragged nearer, and Freya waited. Eventually it croaked itself up a voice. Hesitant first, practicing. Freya's insides were working again. They were working too hard. She put a hand on her chest to make sure her heart wasn't about to pop right out. The thing outside yowled madly. It screamed and yelped and whistled and threw out it all. Freya refused to go and look. She was sorry, in her way. And she was selfish, but in the end it was far too late. The thumb atoms had days since become Freya atoms. There was no mechanism to pry them out of her. She lay nestled in a whirl of screams, and what caught in her heart the most was how good it felt to know there was no way back. They could crawl out of every river and every lake. They could come right up to the house, put their faces against the glass. They could drum on the window panes with mutilated thumbless hands. It was far too late for anything to be done. And even if it wasn't, Freya would refuse to do it. After a while, the screaming stopped, and Freya listened, carefully, as whatever was in the garden dragged itself away. "Did anyone hear the foxes last night?" said her father when morning came. "They've played merry hell with my cuttings." At school, Miss Wallace was in a dark mood. She knew about the thumb. She said it was very important to find out which one of them had done it, and Freya had to work especially hard to keep her breathing normal when she heard that. Jenny Creel asked if that was because mermaids had special powers. Freya wondered if her special mermaid power had maybe made Jenny ask that question. Miss Wallace laughed, and her head danced around her, and she said no. It was nothing like that. It was just vitally important that they learned to take responsibility for their actions. As usual, Fergus took the blame. It was his own fault, thought Freya, from behind her perfect mask. He had never learned to look innocent as she did. Miss Wallace landed on him by elimination. She asked the others, and everyone else knew how to deny it properly, except Fergus, who blushed and squirmed and was refused to go to the bathroom. Freya watched coldly as Fergus was made to go up to the front of the classroom and stand by Miss Wallace, who asked Fergus how he would like it if someone stole his thumb without asking. Fergus mumbled bitterly that he wouldn't mind, and then Miss Wallace opened a drawer and took out her little paper guillotine, the one she used to cut up their name cards, and Fergus shrieked and flew out of the room. Miss Wallace looked down at their faces, white with shock, apart from Freya, who was looking out of the window and following Fergus's trajectory with interest. "Just my little joke," said Miss Wallace, who seemed for the first time a tad unsure. Fergus didn't come into school the next day, or the day after that. On Wednesday, Miss Wallace was cheery again. She told 7C she had a special treat. It was something she'd been working on, arranging all week. Behind her, the whiteboard said grammar in big letters and science underneath that. And because of that, Freya did not let herself get too excited. She was sleeping only very little now. The garden sounds had been peaceful, but required her constant assessment. When she was asleep, clawed starfish scraped their way through her dreams. "Language doesn't make sense," said Miss Wallace when everyone was ready. 7C leaned in. This sounded like one of the good lessons. "I was thinking this morning about words that start with B, like bedeck. Does anyone know what bedeck means? It's a bit old-fashioned. Christina V knew. That's right. It's sort of like putting something on something. And then there's bedew, which is what happens in the mornings, when the weather comes and puts water on the grass in the fields. There's baguette too. You'll have to trust me on that one, 7C, but it's addition, not subtraction. Eva, if I tell you to beware, would that make you more or less aware? Eva didn't know. That's okay. You'd be more aware, I expect. But it doesn't always work. Jason, if I beheaded you, try not to take that personally, you'd have one less head, wouldn't you? But you might think behead should mean to give Jason an additional head. I know, what a thought. Miss Wallace reached under her desk and lifted up a blue cool box. The kind Freya's parents sometimes took with them on picnics to make the sandwiches colder than the sandwiches should be. Since you were all so interested, she said, I thought we could take a closer look at how it worked. And she lifted the mermaid's sad, bruised head out of the box and plopped it down onto her desk. Its thin black lips had fallen down like old elastic, and some of its whiskers had snapped away, and one of the eyes hadn't defrosted right, and looked as if it was halfway collapsed. Most of all, though, the head just looked terribly afraid. Freya screamed, and everyone turned to look, more in surprise than in concern, because, for many of them, it was the first noise they had ever known her to make. They found Fergus face down in the estuary. He floated there, unsteady, and on the mud banks the mermaids howled and cringed away from his puffy, uniformed body. The rescue team kicked at them with their boots, and the mermaids screamed and dove to the very bottom of the water. They crawled into the hollows and dens they had built for themselves, and watched as Fergus was dragged out and breathed into, and pronounced days since dead. Freya wanted to know if his thumbs were still attached, but no one was talking about a thing like that. Miss Wallace didn't come back to the school afterwards. It didn't take long for Freya to come to a decision. Her pillows were up behind her, so she knew she was thinking properly. She had taken a thumb, and Miss Wallace had taken a head, and Fergus was dead in an estuary because of it. And maybe Miss Wallace was dead too, in an oxbow lake. But that Freya couldn't know. All she could know was her one small bit. And still her soul tore at her, and said that it had been worth it. That the glory of her deeds would not be undone, even if they were redeemed. She didn't pack a bag because she had no need of anything after. She left her room and the house and trampled her way down the paths and lanes that she had walked every day before. She passed the school and knew that behind it was the pool, and forever with it the wet and shabby evil of the hut. She walked past the flowers at the gates and didn't stop to look at the pictures of Fergus, in his uniform or on his bike or at somebody's 5th birthday. She reached town and pushed on until she came to the square with the ice cream shop and fish and chips and the small bridge that the river ran underneath. The mermaids were there, with their heads in their arms, their tails kicking up a soft spray in the water beneath. They cocked their heads as she got near and sniffed the air, in case she had brought them something to eat. Freya cried, and her whole body resisted her. It fought against walking another step, but she forced it on. She went up right close to the mermaids, even though the sign next to the bins said to keep a safe distance at all times. She looked into their black eyes, not unkind, not entirely devoid of understanding, and held out her hands to them for absolution.
And welcome back. That was The Hand That Feeds by Louis Inglis Hall. And if you enjoyed that, then he's had a few other stories out in the last couple of years, though this is his first as an EA cast. If you're after other podcast readings, then there's Fishing the Intergalactic Stream at Clarksworld, October 2024, and Unit 6, Intro to Manticores in Apparition Literary Magazine, July 2023. You can also read online, for free, Cold Comfort at Strange Horizons, and The Cow in My Mind at Andromeda Spaceways Magazine. There's links to all of those in the show notes on our website, or you can search them up pretty easily. I'm afraid, though, I couldn't scare up any social media profiles or a website. So if you want to find out about new releases from Louis, then you'll just have to stick a post-it note on your monitor to search every now and then. Louis sent us these notes on The Hand That Feeds. The world looks very different from inside a school. Almost unrecognisable. It was at school that I first read Angela Carter, and the memory of that certainly influenced this story of a girl who meets something monstrous and transgresses irresistibly. I've always found mermaids sinister, too. Sinister and dexterous. Two words deeply connected to the hand. In the end, everything does come down to thumbs. Thank you, Louis, for those notes and for the story. I've been in schools pretty much my whole life. When I fell out of uni post-graduation with no momentum, no motivation, and only an unhealthy dependency on weed, the job I eventually drifted into was IT support in a school, and it's trundled along in that vein ever since, as I still work out what I actually want to do with my life, which at 40 years old with a mortgage and dependents is fine, right? There's definitely still time. Anyway, point is I've known schools from both sides for 35 years, and yes, the world looks very different from inside a school, for the staff as well as the students. They have a strange, distorting effect on your priorities, and the social hierarchy and cliquiness so prevalent in the adolescence is, I'm afraid, contagious and infects the staff body too. Sorry, but I have never known an English department not convinced of their own intellectual and cultural superiority. I said what I said. As much as I have been in schools, though, my two youngest kids have not. They're both currently home educated because the one-size-fits-all approach and education system that we have in the UK does not, funnily enough, fit all. Certainly not neurodivergent kids. And whilst there is theoretically a special educational needs provision, it is so underfunded, oversubscribed and under-scrutinised that it's more of a fantasy than anything we bring to you each week. Given that I largely work from home now, this means I get to see them all day, every day, silver linings and all. And given everything I and my wife went through as undiagnosed kids, at school and otherwise, we have been at pains to openly discuss emotions and mental health with the kids. All of which is to lead up to saying, the way everything seems so important to Freya, absolutely life or death, is uncannily accurate. I think we have a tendency, as adults, to believe we understand kids because we too were once children, and we have a smattering of memories from the time. But, of course, the way memory works is that each time you're actually recalling the last recall, till eventually all you have is a palimpsest of contradictory details filtered through layers of evolving context and values, and you no longer know the original truth of the moment, no matter how sure you are that you do. The fundamental architecture of your brain has changed since your childhood. Your memories are not accurate recollections, and so you cannot, in and of yourself, genuinely understand kids through recall alone. You can only understand them, their priorities and their worldview, and the all-consuming importance of some beliefs, and the loose grip on time that means what they are feeling now is surely how they will feel forever, by listening to them, by accepting and treating them as whole beings, already independent in thought and valid. And you may scoff at the idea that, say, keeping this mermaid thumb forever is the most vitally important thing, and the only way to do that is to take it inside yourself by swallowing it. But it absolutely makes sense, and dismissing it as otherwise is only, in fact, to dismiss yourself in the kid's eyes. I've often said that the world would be a much better place if we listened to each other more. That includes everyone, 2 years old and up. You'd be amazed what you might learn. That was our show for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, your co-editors Shingai Enjoro Kagunda and Eleanor R. Wood, assistant editor Caitlin Tavanovich, audio engineers Devin Martin and Eric Valdez, and our many wonderful first readers, Andrew Cahoe, Craig Jackson, Amalia Harrington, Julia Patt, Kieran Corsaini, Ryan Cole, Sarah S. Messenger, Shrikripa Krishna Prasad, Tava Nova, Tierney Bailey, Zeev Witties, and myself, Matt Dovey. Thank you for letting us share another story with you. The legal bit. PodCastle is part of the Escape Artist Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can share it, and please do, but you cannot sell it and you cannot change it. If you want specifics, check creativecommons.org. Our music is by Shiva in Exile. Everything we do on PodCastle is 100% donor funded, and if you'd like to support what we and the rest of EA do, please join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/EApodcasts. Prefer another method? There's details for supporting us via Twitch, Amazon Prime, Ko-fi and PayPal on escapeartist.net. We'll be back next Tuesday with another fantastic tale. In the meantime, you might care to check out our sister podcasts, Escape Pod for science fiction, Pseudopod for horror, Cast of Wonders for YA speculative fiction, and Catscast for speculative cat stories. If your heart belongs to us though, we'll see you next week. Be safe and be kind.